Chapter 27. Akala. Zelda had assumed that the power of the great fairies was born on their breath. That Mija, like Kotera, would confer her blessing through a current of air, the medium of her life force. She had asked Paya, weeks ago in Kakariko village, if Kotera's blessing had seemed at all like blowing a kiss. Paya had blushed so red that she looked as if she was about to catch fire, shaken her head, and refused, or been unable, to answer out loud. Zelda had let that go, deciding that it was more likely that the power of the fairies was tied in some way to the elements. Zelda was realizing she had assumed, erroneously. Mija brought up one perfectly manicured finger, as long as Zelda's torso, and kissed the tip with luxuriously painted lips. Then, smiling with a look that Zelda could not quite unpack, she reached out and brushed that same fingertip, with all delicacy, against Zelda's own lips. The touch was so soft she was barely sure there had been any contact at all. Mija drew back her hand as her power swirled around Zelda, infusing the bright blue tunic and blouse that she wore. In exchange for flowers and the shards from the horn of a dragon, Dinral had left behind more than a few. In their last meeting, she had been granted a great power. That was how she was choosing to see this. She glanced at Paya, who was a familiar shade of crimson and taking in the scene from between the fingers of the hand she was holding over her face. Well, not everyone could be expected to see things the way that she did. That wouldn't be reasonable at all. Zelda cleared her throat, and Mija reacted not at all. The great fairy had been through all of this before, it seemed, and her smile never wavered.
Are all of the great fairy's blessings,
Zelda began,
communicated through...
She grasped for a word.
Affection? Oh, yes,
Mija said, her voice high and melodic and airy. Her smallest motions were intimate and languid, giving an air of easy friendliness and easy intimacy, though Zelda suspected that the great fairy could lift a lionel above her head and hurl it off the nearby cliffside without much effort.
It is the way of things, you know. Blessings are always an act of love, in one form or another, no matter who is giving them. The stronger the imparting, the more earnest the expression of that love must be.
Mija shifted, leaning forward very slightly.
Of course. It helps when the one seeking a blessing is so sweet.
Zelda cleared her throat again. Right, now she felt like Paya probably did.
Well, thank you. I would have more of your strength added to mine, if you have time. Oh, I do. But first I have questions, if I may. Kotera mentioned that receiving 2 blessings may confer some additional power.
That languid smile split into a grin.
You have a truly hungry mind. It's very endearing, you know. Yes, the strength we add to your armor may bring out some hidden potential, but that will only be true when you are using pieces that are made for each other, that resonate with each other, are part of a set, in other words. And not every set is so special. Is there any way to tell what armor may or may not benefit?
The grin shifted back to a smile.
Only through experimentation, I'm afraid. If you have armor that is uses beyond just being armor, then your chances are much better.
Zelda nodded, going over her list in her head. She had the Zora armor, and matching greaves, but no headpiece, so that was out. The Flamebreaker set might be good, though she couldn't really imagine how much more effective it might be made. Perhaps it could be completely fireproof. The Stealthu, maybe.
You are lost in thought,
Mija said, and laughed at Zelda's flinch.
Don't be embarrassed. It's very cute. Still, you don't have to worry so much, you know? Just try things out. I'm sure it will be fine.
The fairy interlaced her fingers, holding them over her head in a long, deep stretch before lowering her arms again.
You're feeling shy, and I understand, but it's so marked that you've forgotten questions you wanted to ask. So, I'll volunteer information. How's that?
She gestured, with one hand, to the north.
I haven't been getting much news for the past 100 years, but before I lost my power I heard that someone was building an institution on the northern edge of Akala, trying to suss out how weapons and armor were made in the era of the Guardians. You might find something interesting there. And, if you take the main road, you should eventually come to a path that will lead you to the Spring of Power. Your power is already awoken, but it can't hurt to visit a place that's been so important through so many lifetimes, can it? No.
She looked north, too. Derek had said one of her photographs was taken at the Spring of Power, and Pyrrha's assistant was supposed to have a laboratory in the north.
I suppose it cannot. Thank you, Mija. That is very helpful. I'm very glad. Now, Do you have any more armor you would like me to enhance?
Zelda's color rose, and she darted another glance at Paia, who was now peeking out from behind a tree.
Oh, well, if you don't mind, I was hoping that my stealth armor could be a bit sturdier.
The Akala Tower was situated above the Akala Citadel, its blue radiance a counterpoint to the devastation that it stood over. The citadel itself was clean. There had been monsters there, but bringing back the function of the Flying Guardians had taken care of that problem very quickly. Even more than the Stalkers, the Flying Guardians presented a problem that Moblins, Bokoblins, and Lizalfos simply were not prepared to deal with. Zelda thought them truly marvelous, wondered at what other feats of engineering the ancients must have been capable of. She would never be able to work it out on her own. The house that stood at the top of a hill in the northeast was in some ways similar to Pyrrha's laboratory. From her perch atop the tower, and up so high it was cold enough that she and Paia had partaken of a spicy fish fry, prepared in anticipation of moments like this. She could only barely make out the telltale blue flame through the shake slate's lens. She put a marker on it, referenced her map, nodded. Yes, that would be the place. She had already marked a quarry that seemed a likely site for the Spring of Power. Now all they needed to do was make the trip.
We are so high up, Zelda said, that I don't know if my strength would hold out if we used the paragliders for the entire descent. It might be best to set down at the top of that hill, with the 3 trees. Then we can work our way down to the quarry on foot. After that we can.
And that is when she realized how little Paia was responding, verbally or otherwise, and looked over at her companion. Paia, always attentive to a fault, was staring at the middle distance, focusing on nothing. Paia did not react to what Zelda had been saying or the sudden stop. This was not entirely new, but still novel. Zelda let the silence stretch out. 5 seconds passed, then 10.
Paia,
she said at last, and the other girl jumped like a startled rabbit.
What are you thinking about?
Zelda did not have to use her power to deepen her perceptions. Paia's reactions were like a road map for her brain. She instantly and simultaneously flushed, looked around, run her hands together, and took a very long, deep breath to steady herself. She'd been thinking on this enough that she'd probably been having this conversation in her head, but hadn't practiced so much that she could banish her nervousness.
I apologize for my inattentiveness.
Paia started, then winced and broke eye contact as Zelda scowled.
I know. Still, I am sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Shouldn't have. Since you asked, I was thinking about how you relate to the world around you. How the champions did, to it. And Link. It occurred to me that when you were speaking to the honored Mija that it felt like the world revolved, in some fundamental way, around the royal family's battle with Ganon.
Her expression darkened, brows drawn together.
Grandmother always liked to say that the history of the royal family is also the history of Ganon. Anyway, it just made me think about how much seems to depend on you, and how much of the world will seek to aid you in the fight against the darkness. Such as, for instance.
And here Paia wrung her hands together even harder, but her face became perfectly, alarmingly, neutral, as if she'd been practicing.
Hypothetically speaking, do you suppose that the great fairies will only use their magic on the armor of the princess and the hero?
That sent Zelda's mind wandering down paths that made her forget utterly about trying to dissect the shifting of Paia's expressions, the oddness of her behavior. She knew intimately how much she had believed, 100 years ago, that the world was hinging on her ability to seal Ganon. Truth be told, she believed, no, she knew that, now. But did all the world see it that way? How conceited, how self-absorbed, would she have to be to believe that she was the only one so important to be able to beseech the gods for a blessing? Were not all the peoples of Hyrule said to be beloved of Hylia? Why wouldn't that be true of other gods, or any major powers? So, she responded,
based on what Kotera said, I do not believe so. If people went on pilgrimage to make offerings to the great fairies, and at the time the sisters were at the height of their power, then I must believe that they would have granted blessings in return. Perhaps, in the distant past, the armorers of Hyrule supplemented their art with the magic of greater powers. That would make sense to me. Perhaps I will ask Mija about it, when we speak to her again. I don't know how old the great fairies are, but perhaps she would have some insight into the way things used to be, even if not in that antiquity.
During this, Paia was nodding thoughtfully, eyes focused on Zelda's, visibly turning these ideas over in her head.
Did you suppose she might be willing to enhance my clothing?
Instantly Zelda's guts turned to ice. She'd done all that fortifying, turning the least of her clothing into armor that could turn aside an arrow as if it were a whisper, and hadn't even considered getting that done for Paia.
Oh, my goodness, Paia, I'm so sorry. I hadn't even thought of that. How? Oh, thoughtless I've been to armor myself while you are as vulnerable to our enemies as the day we left the village together.
Zelda realized that if someone were to fire a bomb arrow at her, she would live, though not comfortably. Paia would very likely die on the spot. She tried very hard not to be sick, barely succeeded.
I'm sure she would be. I mean, I'm not sure, but we can ask her when we speak to her next. We can go right now. Shall we head back down?
Paia, for her part, seemed very calm, and Zelda marveled at her graciousness.
Thank you, but no. I think I will be all right until we have occasion to speak to her again. But we will ask her. That's not a question. If you're feeling shy, just let me know, and I'll ask her on your behalf. I think I will be able to manage for myself.
What did the rise in her color even mean now? Anger? Embarrassment? Frustration? Zelda had to fight down the urge to reach out with the power and just instantly understand everything Paia was feeling without ambiguity as the other woman stepped onto the edge of the tower's viewing platform.
It will be a long trip down. Shall we go?
Zelda was still fuming at herself when the two of them leaped off the side of the tower and began a long glide down to the top of the hill. So focused was she on how badly she had behaved, how poorly she had treated Paia, that she did not see how long it took for her friend's complexion to normalize.
What is it? What's wrong with me?
Hylia did not answer Zelda. None of the gods did. None of the spirits did. But she felt it most sharply with Hylia, whose statue only looked on serenely, perfect and blessed and distant and cold.
Percy,
she said again, and meant it, too empty to even feel shame at her blasphemy. Her own voice rejoined in her head. Oh, yes, why wouldn't the gods grant you mighty power when you're so grateful to them? She tried to push it away, but the words weighed on her as if they had been cast in iron, dragging her down, making her every movement heavier, worse than the water-soaked ceremonial dress. It was unfair. All of this was unfair. But she was still missing something, still fundamentally broken. Both of those things could be true, couldn't they? They weren't mutually exclusive. And if one of them had to be false, there would be no more praying tonight, no pretending to serenity. She turned away from the statue, rubbing at her eyes, trying to be quiet enough that Link wouldn't hear her, only to see that he was no longer facing away from her. He must have heard the abuses she heaped on the divine. And now he saw her like this. Deliberately she filled her cupped hands with water and washed her face. She rinsed 3 times, running her fingers over her eyebrows, her cheeks, her mouth. If she could have, she would have scrubbed away every mark of her shame, every evidence that she had ever wept at her own failure. But she couldn't. Link would have probably seen it, anyway. When she looked up, he was standing in the water, at the base of the steps, slightly to the side of center. She grabbed 2 bunches of her dress and slowly waded toward him, trying hard to look straight ahead, rather than at his face. He never, ever presumed to place himself where he might touch her, save by her instruction, and after struggling to rise from the spring of courage, she had asked him to be on hand in any other, similar cases. Better that he give her support than she should have to scrabble on stone steps with her hands because this stupid dress was so heavy. He held out his hand for her and she took it, using him as leverage to ascend the steps. He was absolutely steady, as much as the stone beneath her feet, and his eyes were on her. Was he wondering if she would fall? Trip? Break down crying again? Well, she couldn't blame him, in any case. Reaching the top of the steps, she took a moment to just stand there and drip, letting the cold wash over her like a kind of special finish to her misery and self-pity. Yes, that was just about perfect. She took the bunched-up fabric in her hand and wrung it out, accomplishing remarkably little, then walked out of the temple. Link followed her at a respectful distance. Their fire had burned down, but Link restored it quickly, with the calm expertise of someone used to keeping warm without walls to shield him. And, just as at the Spring of Courage, he set up a thin, tall screen of woven reeds that perimeter around the fire, then stood with his back to it so that a screen separated him from the light and the warmth, and he looked out into the night. Zelda pulled aside one part of the screen, muttered her thanks, and stepped in before pulling the reed wall shut behind her. That moment, when she was completely enclosed so that it was just her and the fire, was the first moment of real privacy she'd had in many hours. She savored it, before guilt soured that feeling. Link had cleaned and folded her riding uniform. When he'd had the time to do that, she had no idea, and left it on top of her traveling pack. She removed the dress and donned her warm, dry clothes, and tried not to be overwhelmed at the sight of a coarse, warm blanket tucked beneath where her uniform had rested. This she wrapped around her shoulders, sat down, and took another moment to appreciate the simple reality of physical comfort before saying, "I'm finished." Link took down the screen and folded it, packing it away as Zelda sat by the fire and warmed herself. Her dress he took in his hands, rolled it up, wrung out with a strength that she still had trouble wrapping her head around, then laid it flat on an incline provided by a crumbling wall. He would launder it later, she imagined, though she wasn't sure when he would sleep. He worked with remarkable speed, setting up the cookpot over the fire, prepping his ingredients, arranging everything he needed to make their dinner. Originally, he had insisted on cooking for them separately, serving her fare that was both finer and more delicate than what he'd made for himself. It hadn't been easy to convince him to share meals with her, really share them, that is, but once she had gotten him to do it once, she made sure he never did anything else. She liked to watch him cook, and knowing that they would share in his work made her feel less guilty. He normally hummed to himself, happily lost in the act of creation, but he was not doing so now. Perhaps he had read her mood. In very little time he handed her a plate, and she mumbled thanks as she took it from him. Salmon meuniere, topped with Hyrulean herbs and served on a bed of meticulously washed rice. A feast, really, and he had managed to prepare it with the equivalent of one cast iron pan. In spite of herself, despite how hungry she would have said she wasn't only minutes ago, the smell of the herbs and butter made her mouth water. The first bite confirmed her expectations. It was delicious, and hearty, and felt intensely nourishing in a way that only oily fish can be. Taking her first bite as his cue, Link started in on his own plate, and this Zelda took the time to watch. Watching him cook was one thing, watching him eat was quite another. Where most people merely ate, Link seemed to inhale food as if it were air. By the time she was halfway through chewing her third mouthful, he had cleaned his plate to a sparkling sheen, not one drop of butter or a grain of rice left behind by his alarmingly precise fork. Fascinating. Mildly terrifying, but still fascinating. Zelda ate slowly while Link went about the business of setting up camp, erecting the tent she would spend the night in and laying out her bedroll and pillows inside of it. His own bedroll he left rolled up. He would lay it out across the entrance to her tent when she had gone to sleep. After lifting the cooking pot, he stepped away from the light of the fire, tending to the area around the camp and checking on the horses before returning and taking his seat across from her. She had thought she wasn't hungry, but before long Zelda was let with an empty plate, which she held out to him. This he took, setting it aside with his own. "Thank you," she said, breaking the long silence. "That was delicious. You looked like you needed something warm." She nodded. He meant warm, in more than one way, she suspected. Hence all the butter, which he treated as a comfort food. She hadn't been shy about her need for comfort, she supposed. What a pathetic sight she must have made, even to him who judged her not at all. Art. That almost asked its own question, didn't it? And she was too done to force herself to reconsider before the words were out of her mouth. So? Link. He had already been watching her, waiting for her to speak, but now he snapped her and even sharper attention. I felt nothing. None of the voices from the spirit world spoke to me. Hylia remained silent. There is no spark of the power inside of me. It makes me feel empty. It makes me wonder. Why? No. She would not lose control now. Not in front of him. Not again. Not twice in one accursed day. She breathed through her nose. Why do you still follow me? You've seen me at my lowest. You've heard what the people of Hyrule think of me. You've heard what my own father thinks of me. Of my failures. So, why? Is it out of duty? Is it out of pity? For a long, long time, Link didn't say anything. He blinked rapidly for a few moments. Then his eyes darted around the clearing in which they sat, but he never turned his face from her. Months ago, she would have thought him disgusted, sitting in judgment of her, but now she knew that she had put him in an impossible situation, asking him questions she couldn't possibly expect him to answer truthfully. She also found that she could not even feel shame for doing this to him. Instead of speaking, he rose, stepping around the fire toward her. He unbuckled the belt holding the master sword to his back, then unfastened the sheath. Then he kneeled, holding up the sword that seals the darkness in its scabbard, offering it to her. He did not lower his eyes. She looked right back, but he gave no signal more than what he'd already done. But, then, how much more explicit could he be, really? She took the weapon in her hands. It wasn't very heavy. Good swords almost never were. And what sword could be finer than this? But it was very long. It felt solid and did not rattle, as if the scabbard had been molded to the blade that rested in it.
What am I supposed to? Please look at it, he said.
This felt like blasphemy, but if she felt that way, then she could only imagine how it felt for him. The master sword was said to be the very embodiment of the hero's soul, the ultimate proof that they were who they were supposed to be. It was as if he had put his beating heart in her hands. She couldn't imagine anything more vulnerable. How could she possibly refuse? The sound of the blade being pulled free of its scabbard was sonorous, but it was so long that she couldn't pull it out all the way on her own. Before she could struggle with it, Link took the scabbard in his hands and pulled it away, letting her pull the sword free. There was a moment where she was afraid she would let the blade dip, maybe even touch the ground, but she wrapped both her hands around the hilt and hoisted it. And felt nothing. She didn't know why, but she had been expecting to feel something. Some echo of the surety that Link seemed to have, some part of the purpose that was invested in the blade. The barest remnant of an ancient voice. But there was nothing. Only a sword. She squeezed her eyes shut, willed herself back from the brink.
I don't understand what you want me to see,
she said, and thought she sounded very level.
The master sword rested in the Lost Woods,
Link said, and that pulled her back to reality. She had heard rumors of this, but from what she could learn, no one had accompanied Link on his journey into the forest. Some had tried to follow him and only ended up back at the entrance, chased by laughter.
When I came to it, it was resting in a stone dais.
He set his mouth, deciding whether to say something.
A lot happened. What matters is that the act of drawing the sword from its resting place drained me. The guardian of the forest told me that if I hadn't proven myself, made myself into who I was supposed to be, then I would have died. He said that only the hero could pull the sword free.
He offered the scabbard, and she carefully lowered the sword and slid it back into place. Link took it back into his hands, showing reverence not for the sword but for her, and for some stupid reason that hurt her. She wouldn't voice that hurt. She knew he didn't mean to. She would wait for him to explain. Then he said,
even after it's drawn, only the worthy may touch the sword. No one else can hold it.
The crackling of the fire seemed very quiet in the clearing, against the stillness of the air. The horses were at rest, and the bugs were calm, and Link was looking at her from across the fire, holding the master sword that had been in her hands. She looked at her palms, then at the sword. There was a disconnect here, deeper than the fact that if she was worthy then she should have the power. Deeper even than the idea of worthiness itself. She saw the faith in his eyes and felt a pressure in her chest.
How?
She said, her voice cracking.
Did you know I could hold the sword?
He did not answer. He strapped the scabbard to his back. She sat in silence for a while, then rose and went to her tent, closing the flap behind her. Jaren and Robbie were sharing in the quiet of the laboratory, the hum of the machinery and the arcing sounds of discharging power providing a low, soothing backdrop to the silence between them. This was the silence of the long-wed, satisfied rather than sullen, appreciative rather than apprehensive. The son Grant was on a trip searching near the citadel for remnants of armor that might still be recoverable, and he had gone on so many of these that their relentless anxieties had given way to a warm kind of familial confidence. All was right with the world. In his many, many decades, Robbie was not sure that he'd ever felt quite this comfortable. The door to the laboratory opened, and through his goggles he could make out two figures. His eyesight was going, so he was left only with their silhouettes, a young woman, probably Hylian, wearing a hood, and for a moment he thought he was looking at Impa, but he pulled himself back to reality and realized the other woman could only be Paya, based on her hair.
Welcome,
he said, setting his feet apart and turning to face his guests as Paya shut the door softly behind her.
Jaren, we have visitors. Paya is here. I suspect you'll
He still dreamed, some nights, about the moment when he and the singer, he'd forgotten the man's name in the intervening century, had found Link and Zelda there, just outside of Fort Hateno, the world a smoking ruin around him. Link, shouting orders that Robbie barely heard, and Zelda, their princess, on the ground, and there had been so much smoke and blood She looked down at him with great blue eyes as clear as water, and he knew her instantly. He fell to both of his knees, performing the full obeisance, removing his goggles so he could lower his head properly. He did not weep. He had run out of tears long ago, but his body shook so badly that he didn't feel the pressure of Zelda's hand on his shoulder until she squeezed, ever so gently.
"Please,"
she said, and he looked up as he heard Jarian gasp next to him.
"I need your help."
Who wouldn't have responded to such a request? He nodded. She took her hand away. He rose, with Jarian's help, and each squeezed the other's fingers to assure themselves that they were still there. Then the work began. He did not have to explain what was happening to Jarian, though she'd never seen Zelda before. They'd spent decades preparing for this day, and there was never any question as to what was happening. Zelda was as knowledge-hungry as she'd always been, instantly fascinated by Cherry, that is, the ancient oven, and all the different manufacturing processes it was capable of performing automatically. The armor and weapon schematics he'd refined over the course of a century, the automation process and interface that he and Jarian had designed together, the logistics behind using any individual piece as fuel for the armor or weapons. She wanted to hear all of it. Paya made herself busy being near Zelda the entire time, as if ready to fend off an attack. Just like her grandmother, really.
"I see you have a listing here for a giant ancient core if we were to try to manufacture a bow."
Zelda tapped her finger against the ancient oven's terminal as she spoke.
"Yes, Princess."
He'd nearly forgotten his manners. Not speaking directly to anyone who had ranked him in a century had made him relaxed, complacent. It was difficult to be as deferential as he should be.
"You might find these when destroying guardians, though the violence of their destruction tends to make these difficult to recover. The smaller cores are actually not power cores at all."
Robbie stopped and stared at the princess, who was looking at the schematics for the ancient greaves.
"They are relays between the core and the actuators that drive movement, transformers that regulate energy output to prevent the Guardian's drive from breaking it in half."
Robbie looked to Jarian, whose eyebrows had risen nearly to her hairline, then turned back to Zelda.
Yes. That would imply that each Guardian has at least 6.
Zelda said, frowning her consternation. The actual number was closer to 10, but it would be unwise to correct her.
"A shame to think of wasting a Guardian, but from just one we could recover."
She tapped her finger again.
"Doctor, how many parts would we need to make a set of the armor, each weapon, and a shield?"
He'd crunched those numbers thousands of times. They came to him instantly.
95 gears, 40 springs, 20 shafts, 20 screws, 18 cores, and 1 giant core. That, plus a number of springs and shafts equal to the desired quantity of arrows.
She nodded.
"Paya, where would you say we could destroy a number of recovered Guardians without affecting their patrol coverage and endangering nearby settlements?"
Recovered Guardians. He knew what those words meant, but in that order? It made almost no sense.
"The Citadel to the south,"
Paya said, instantly. She'd apparently been thinking about this very hard. She seemed so different from the girl he'd last seen when she was only knee-high.
"One flying Guardian is capable of keeping the mountain clean of monsters, and they have the advantage of being directly beneath a travel marker."
Jarian, his fiery muse, spoke where he couldn't.
"Recovered Guardians? Travel markers? My lady, please forgive my impertinence, but what are you talking about?" "The Shaker Slate allows us to travel between guidance stones instantly,"
Zelda said, taking the slate off her hip and activating its view screen. Robbie tried not to gawk at it. The real thing was so much more elegant than the enormous monstrosity that Pyrrha had been developing.
"As to the Guardians, I can use my power to restore them to their original function. I have pictures that I can show you, but I fear I must ask for your indulgence. May we discuss this once Paya and I have returned with the necessary parts?"
He must not have been able to move or speak, because in the distance she heard Jarian say,
"Of course, my lady."
Paya and Zelda both bowed their respect, the latter of which made Robbie's hair stand on end, and then dissolved into streams of flowing blue light. And, just like that, the quiet reigned again. Robbie and Jane were left staring into the space that had been occupied by a family friend and the princess to whom they all owed fealty as the machinery hummed along behind them. Robbie took off his goggles again, rubbed at his eyes.
"We're not charging them a single rupee,"
Jane said.
"Not one,"
Robbie agreed. For the first time in many years, Jaren went to retrieve the fire to light the ancient oven's furnace. There would be a great deal of work to be done soon. End of chapter.